This is a CBS News special report. I'm Carissa Lawson. Breaking news from the Middle East. Israel has launched what it's calling a preemptive strike against Iran. We understand this is a joint U.S. and Israeli strike, which hit in Iran's capital of Tehran, near the offices of Iran's supreme leader, where we could see a cloud of smoke rising from the area. The Israeli Defense Ministry said in a statement that it launched the attack to remove threats from Iran to the state of Israel. It said it was expecting a missile and drone attack from Iran in, quote, the immediate future. The Defense Ministry has also declared an immediate state of emergency in all areas of the country. This Israeli strike comes on the heels of a massive U.S. military buildup in the area. The U.S. has been assembling a vast fleet of fighter jets and warships in the region in an attempt to pressure Iran into a deal to dismantle its nuclear program. Joining us now, we have Charlie D'Agata, who's in Israel, to tell us exactly what we know. Charlie?
Yeah, good morning, Claire. So at about 8:20 this morning, we awoke, or most of us were awake anyway, to air raid sirens, which would suggest that we had incoming fire here, but it wasn't that. It was actually the Israeli Defense Forces alerting the people of Israel that an attack was underway in Tehran. So about 8:20 here, about 10:50 in Tehran. We then learned of explosions from our folks on the ground in Tehran, as you said, at the headquarters of the Supreme Leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. We understand from Iranian sources anyway that he was already moved to a safer area. In fact, he hasn't been seen in public for a number of days. And there are rumors he may have already gone deep underground. We then started chasing it up. We learned that it was a joint U.S. and Israeli attack, and there are explosions heard in 4 other cities inside Iran. Iran has now said that they intend to attack with crushing blows. As I said, we've only had 1 air raid siren so far. There's no reports of any incoming yet. The Israelis, as you mentioned in the beginning of this, is describing this as a preemptive strike. You know, we have to lay the groundwork here. Israeli defense officials that we spoke to and intelligence officials say that Iran has fully capable ballistic missiles, 1,800 of them at least, many of them within reach of this country, also within reach of U.S. forces in the area. You talked about that massive buildup that we've got here. The USS Gerald R. Ford should be off the coast of Israel soon. That's the aircraft carrier, the second one there. The USS Abraham Lincoln already in place. What we don't know yet is the scale of this first attack, as the Israelis are calling it a preemptive strike. And, you know, as explained by officials here, the Iranians will want to get their missiles off the ground as soon as possible. If the Israelis are going to want to essentially wipe out any of their missile defense systems, and this is all taking place in the background of talks between the United States and Tehran about limiting its nuclear program. But as an auxiliary, as far as the Israelis are concerned, with good reason, they want to diminish or completely reduce Iran's ability to attack them with these middle to long-range ballistic missiles. And again, that puts U.S. forces at risk, too. Al-Udeid, which is the largest airbase in this region for the United States, came under attack, you can remember, last June. They were sort of pre-warned, but they still had to launch a huge counterattack in order for those missiles to not get through. That was in Qatar. Again, these Iranians still have plenty of that firepower there, and they've been reconstituting it by some measures, about 100 of those missiles a month, which is one of the reasons that's the urgency for the Israelis. So I think what we're waiting for now, first of all, to see if Iran is going to launch a counterattack, whether this preemptive strike was perhaps messaging. Because, again, we are in the middle of talks. The United States and Tehran are in the middle of talks. Secretary of State Marco Rubio is actually scheduled to come here on Monday. That doesn't necessarily mean that is putting that on hold. The last time President Trump threatened Iran, he gave Iran a 2-week window to comply to demands and then bombed 3 days later. So we actually have seen this in the precedents last year. You remember Operation Midnight Hammer, where B-2 bombers, stealth bombers, targeted Iran's nuclear facilities. We might see a return to that. But as you said, we're seeing the largest buildup of firepower in this region, and that says a lot since the invasion of Iraq in 2003.
Charlie, you touched on the huge military buildup in the region. Let's dig a little deeper into that. Talk about what's been happening leading up to this very moment.
Yeah, well, so first of all, I'm going to take you back a few weeks ago when the huge demonstrations were taking place in Iran. And President Trump then warned the regime and told the people of Iran, look, we're going to protect you. And by any measure, thousands of people were killed. By some Western measures, may have been tens of thousands of people were killed. The idea at the time was that the United States simply did not have the military capacity, not just to strike Iran. That's pretty. They've always been capable of doing that at any time. But you have to be prepared for how Iran is going to strike back. And at that time, there wasn't even another carrier in the region. Now, over the course of the past couple of weeks, they sent the Abraham Lincoln with 4 or 5 F-35 and F-18 squadrons of fighter jets here in Israel for the first time that I can remember. F-22 stealth fighter jets are actually on Israeli soil. That doesn't happen. There's a lot of cooperation, but there's very rarely a time where you have U.S. forces operating inside Israel, especially with the strike package like the F-22 stealth fighters. Again, they turned the USS Gerald R. Ford that was in the Caribbean. It was already on assignment, and it had been deployed and deployed again. It's on extension toward this area. So that would not have been a decision that was taken lightly. In addition to that, we've been tracking, and airline trackers and Air Force trackers have been looking at all kinds of squadrons of more fighter jets that are just like plowed into this region, right? We have the U.S. Fifth Fleet in Bahrain. That's the naval base. Al Udeid, as I explained that, is in Qatar. And you have, along with that package, all the people that have got to run those fighter jets and refuelers. And that is where we've seen that kind of traffic, the refuelers, the fighter jets, the cargo aircraft. This is the United States on war footing. Now, I've said that before, and it sounds alarmist, but you have to remember that this is what the Pentagon does. This is what the Department of Defense does. It sets up for whatever may come. And what may come may be a severe Iranian retaliation, and they're going to want to protect U.S. forces in this region and really prepare for any sort of contingency. So that's why we've seen this massive buildup. So a massive buildup doesn't necessarily mean a massive invasion or a massive fight. Critically, there are no ground troops that are part of this package, which would suggest sort of sending people into Iran or a ground invasion. This is mostly an aerial package. You've got at least a dozen warships, which are armed with Tomahawk cruise missiles, hundreds of Tomahawk cruise missiles, all capable of reaching Iran. So you start to look at what the military has put in place when you're trying to predict what may come. And this is a large-scale, protracted attack against Iran that they're preparing for, and preparing for how Iran might strike back. And in the past, we talked about Israel's vaunted Iron Dome. Well, during the 12-day war last year, those missiles got through. In fact, just about 2 blocks away, it hit and took down a couple of apartment buildings. There's this massive blast radius, and that is getting through the Iron Dome and getting past U.S. defenses. And that's just a hint of it. That's just a sample of what can happen. That was nowhere near what Israeli intelligence believes is still the capacity that Iran has within its group of missiles and defenses.
That's a massive potential firepower there. But what are the potential targets in Iran with all of that in the region right now?
So that's a very good question, because when the U.S. military and the Israeli military determine what may happen, they will put together what's called a strike package. And we've learned ourselves that U.S. military advisors have been telling the president, including the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Dan Kane, obviously Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, has been telling the president, this is what we've got in place, and these are our options. What do those options look like? Well, limited strikes. You could go after regime targets. The Israelis have made very clear and very public they want to destroy or denigrate the Iranian missiles because they are an existential threat to this country, much more so than the potential threat of a nuclear weapon, which is several months or years down the line by some estimates. The United States can also have the opportunity to go after Iran's missile facilities once again, because there is evidence, according to U.S. officials anyway, in the administration, that the Iranians have been trying to reconstitute their nuclear program, which they say is for peaceful means. The United States and others believe that they are bent and intent on making a nuclear weapon and the delivery process to fire that weapon. So from the top to the bottom, you might see limited strikes against regime targets. If that is, we'll have to get actual confirmation, but the Israelis are saying they went after, the Iranians are saying it was the headquarters of the regime. There are several areas of that to go after. They could go after the Revolutionary Guard, Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the military, essentially Iran's military. There are plenty of targets, including the headquarters, which has been hit before. There are military assets throughout Iran. They are very good at spreading out those assets and those missiles. Some of them are mobile, about 350, 400 of those are mobile. And then some of them are also set in the ground as silos. And that, as far as the Israelis would be concerned, that would be the sort of preemptive strike. You're going to want to go after what Iran is capable of firing back. After that, it becomes a policy issue, whether this is about regime change and whether you do go after government buildings, whether you do go after Iran's military, whether you do go after Iran's leadership, and whether you go after the regime. And again, if that happens, they have to expect that Iran is going to fire everything back as quickly as they can before, while they can still use it. So these are the scenarios that they would have gamed out. They would have looked at any one of these opportunities. If A happens, what happens when B happens? What does that mean to Israel? Should Israel go in first? Does Israel need the green light to go in first? Israel has been, we know this for a fact, Israel has been providing some of the intelligence and target acquisition, kind of saying this is where this battalion is, this is where those missiles are located. There's plenty of surveillance and human intelligence coming out of Tehran from the Israelis, who are taking the lead on that to sort of pick out which targets, potential targets, they can choose. So you are looking at a sort of sliding scale of, are these going to be limited strikes? Are they going to send a message? Are you going after regime change? Or are you going to absolutely cripple Iran's capability and defense capability of striking back to Israel and, of course, potentially to U.S. forces in this region?
And speaking of striking back, how would Iran retaliate against both Israeli and U.S. interests?
Well, they have long-range and middle-range, medium-range missiles and ballistic missiles. And they also have, as we have witnessed in the past, both here and in other countries, a very elaborate, certainly in terms of numbers, drones. Now, you might think, well, drones are easy to take down with the sophisticated weaponry that we see in the Iron Dome here. And the Iron Dome sounds like one thing, but it's actually several layers of missile defenses, so from the highest to the bottom, literally and physically, of what they're capable of. But what we've seen in the past is when Iran wanted to attack Israel during the 12-day war, they kept some of their powder dry, maybe half of what they had in their missile supplies, but they flood the area. The first thing that happened, and we were here, we're watching it, they send the drones in. So that alerts the Iron Dome that there's something coming in. Now, in the middle of the Iron Dome, trying to look at where these weapons are pointed, they take a priority on populated areas. They take a priority on military bases to make sure that those places are protected better than most. You know, if it's going to hit the ocean, fine. If it's going to hit out in the middle of the desert where there's nothing there, fine. If it's going to populated areas, that immediately takes the priority. So if they send in a wave of drones, then the Iron Dome has to sort of cherry pick what's coming in. You've got drones coming in, and then you got the much faster missiles that are coming right in the middle of that, kind of like hiding needles in a haystack. And they've got to try to intercept that as well. So that is what the Iranians are capable of. And when we take you back to the attack on Al-Udeid, which the United States was essentially forewarned that this was going to come, because the Iranians have been careful about not harming U.S. troops in this region for obvious reasons, because of the repercussions that may follow. So they were warned. The United States fired up their Patriot missile defense systems. And that was the largest launch of those Patriot missile defense systems in the history of the United States. And all the conflicts and wars that they've been involved in, that was the biggest launch. And that was to take out the incoming missiles from Iran, again, that they knew were coming. And the Qataris themselves had their own defenses that were taking those missiles down. And that's just one hint of one area, of one base, albeit a very large base, that came under an attack. And you can certainly the U.S. officials and military officials are planning that they're not going to be forewarned. And there are multiple areas and between 30 and 40,000 U.S. troops spread across this region and spread out. Remember, there are assets at sea here, too. Those 12 warships that I was talking about, at least. There are supply ships. There are the carriers, which will be among the most protected U.S. naval assets in this region. You know, the USS Abraham Lincoln, which is in the Arabian Sea, as I said. I'm not exactly sure yet because we were tracking the USS Gerald R. Ford. We knew that it was headed here from Crete, but I don't think it's what the military calls on station, so I don't think it's operational, but I could be corrected on that because we're certainly within that window that may happen. So the Iranians will be taking a close look as much as they can with their own sort of intelligence and surveillance and reconnaissance to see where those U.S. assets are, what they can go after. There's another U.S. base in Erbil in northern Iraq. There was a U.S. base a little bit further south in Iraq that has now been cleared out of U.S. forces there, so that's been drawn down entirely. Again, there's the naval base at Bahrain. All of these areas will be very well protected, but it really comes down to the volume of what the Iranians will try to fire back at U.S. Keep calling them assets, but potential U.S. military targets in this region.
A lot to digest now and in the coming days. Charlie D'Agata in Israel, thank you so much. Joining us now is Olivia Gazis, our CBS News national security reporter. And the first question I have for you, Olivia, is what do we know about the timing of these Israeli strikes in relation to the ongoing talks between the U.S. and Iran?
Absolutely, Carissa. So here's what we know tonight about the diplomatic signals and the embassy movements, steps that have often preceded a deteriorating security environment and can often indicate potential military activity that everybody was on the alert for. We had seen some visible measures to move U.S. personnel out of harm's way, but not on the scale of past large-scale drawdowns, and nothing that would have clearly signaled a sweeping or sustained campaign. Usually, embassy departures are accompanied by public warnings issued because the U.S. government is required to share security information with private American citizens when that information is provided to embassy personnel. So early Friday, the U.S. Embassy in Jerusalem authorized the departure of non-emergency staff and family members, citing unspecified safety risks, and it advised private Americans in Israel to consider leaving on commercial flights while those options were available. Moments ago, the U.S. ambassador to Israel, Mike Huckabee, also urged Americans in the country to stay close to shelters. We've also seen the U.S. Embassy in Qatar issue a shelter-in-place advisory for all U.S. government personnel and American citizens there. As Charlie mentioned, Doha hosts the largest U.S. military installation in the Middle East, which is a significant and potentially symbolic retaliatory target for Iran. But otherwise, throughout the day on Friday, U.S. officials had strongly denied reports of additional personnel movements in Bahrain, in Kuwait, in Iraq. And we are still awaiting confirmation on whether there will be any similar drawdowns or alerts in those areas. Also, as Charlie mentioned and you've discussed, it was announced today that Marco Rubio intends to travel to Israel to meet with Benjamin Netanyahu to discuss Iran. U.S. officials said Lebanon and other regional issues. We have already asked whether that trip is still on track and haven't received confirmation. Very notably, at this critical moment and in a break from precedent, Rubio was not planning to travel with a press corps. And yes, all of this is happening as diplomatic appeals to the last minute continued. Margaret Brennan spoke today with Oman's foreign minister, whose country has served as a key intermediary in the nuclear negotiations that had taken place to this point. He urged time for more talks, citing what he described as substantial progress toward a potential agreement over Iran's nuclear program, and warning that military strikes wouldn't resolve the underlying issues. Technical talks had been scheduled to resume on Monday in Vienna and include the IAEA, the nuclear watchdog there. Obviously, all very much in question now that these strikes are underway.
Well, Olivia, we're hearing from President Trump now. He has issued this statement here. He's confirming the U.S. involvement in the strikes in Iran, saying, quote, a short time ago, the United States military began major combat operations in Iran. Our objective is to defend the American people by eliminating Imminent threats from the Iranian regime, a vicious group of very hard, terrible people. Olivia, what do you make of that statement from the president?
Well, clearly a continuing indication that the president had been deeply dissatisfied with the course of negotiations that had taken place to this point. Most recently, his envoys, Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff, had met with the Iranians in Geneva. There was word that they were disappointed with what the Iranians had put on the table over the course of those talks. And you can recall also the broader context here. This is coming in the aftermath of massive protests in Iran that began in early February amid really broad economic unrest that people were simply not getting didn't have enough to subsist on. The regime issued a tremendous crackdown in those protesters, resulting in at a minimum thousands of deaths. The president recently put the figure at 32,000 people who may have been injured or killed in the course of that crackdown. So he had urged that killing to stop. He indicated some satisfaction in mid-February that the regime had suspended executions and been satisfied that the crackdown on the Iranian people had been subsided, but in signaling that he needed to hear from the Iranians that the nuclear portfolio was going to be closed, that enrichment was off the table, that Iran would never pursue a nuclear weapon. He kept insisting that those are words he needed to hear. And even though Iranian officials were saying publicly that they were not in pursuit of a nuclear weapon, unsatisfactory to the president, clearly the talks on Thursday didn't get as far as it needed to go. Here, the president is obviously undertaking this decision to jointly engage in these strikes with Israel.
All right, Olivia, we're going to go back to Charlie D'Agata now. Charlie, we have a question for you. There you are. So let's talk a second about the strikes that the U.S. Hit against Iran last year. And let's talk about what was accomplished then at that time.
Yeah, so it was an attack against Iran's nuclear facilities or suspected nuclear facilities, and they hit 3 different sites. And what we saw was a number, 5 or 6 of B-2. These are the most advanced stealth bombers in the world, the most advanced bombers in the world. And those came from the United States. You know, when we're on the ground here, we try to predict what's going to happen, as we were discussing earlier. Well, what is the U.S. military sent, and what does that mean? What does that look like? So that came from left field. Not here, came from the United States. A number of these B-2 stealth freedom bombers, as they were brought in, keeping in mind the Israeli military had already severely degraded Iranian air defenses. But as they came in, they were flanked by F-22 stealth fighter jets, the same that are here now, and F-35s. I keep repeating this stealth, really important. So you got a stealth bomber going in. You have the escort from the F-22s and F-35s, and they dropped, deep penetrating bombs into these 2 areas, 2 nuclear facilities where they were going after the centrifuges. Now, at the same time, there was a sub that was parked off the coast, and it fired 24 Tomahawk cruise missiles at another facility. So this wasn't necessarily going deep underground. Cruise missiles can hit, but they can't penetrate the same way that the B-2 bombers that were firing what's called Moabs that had deeply penetrated, especially Fordo and Natanz. Those are the 2 facilities that the Americans were really trying to knock out. We were trying to get an after-battle damage assessment. We didn't get as much as we had hoped for. We were told several times that was classified, but they were trying to get to the centrifuges, and they believed some of that damage was done. I mean, they went beyond that. President Trump and others used the word obliterated Iran's nuclear programs, essentially so that they couldn't rebuild a bomb even if they wanted to. Now, what was a question that the IAEA, the UN nuclear watchdog, had already been monitoring was the amount of uranium, hundreds of kilograms, 460 kilograms of uranium that the Iranians are thought to have moved around. So now when the conversations are taking place between the United States and Iran about Iran's nuclear weapons programs, at issue is, first of all, where's the uranium? There are questions about maybe getting that uranium out how much the Iranians are going to do in cooperating with that. Again, they continue to say that this is for peaceful means. They are not producing a weapon. They're going to want to have access to that, possibly American inspectors to verify that, certainly UN, IAEA inspectors to verify that, and a complete cessation of trying to attain or, excuse me, to increase enrich their nuclear material. That was all part of what was going on, and those discussions, as far as we're aware, are still going on. But that was the initial wave, the initial strike on Iran's nuclear facilities, and that happened back in June. It was something called Operation Midnight Hammer, led by these B-2 stealth bombers, flanked by F-35s and F-22s, and we might see a return to that. The assets are certainly in place.
Charlie, we're going to break away from you for just a second because we now have a video statement from President Trump's Truth Social account, so we're going to listen in.
A short time ago, the United States military began major combat operations in Iran. Our objective is to defend the American people by eliminating imminent threats from the Iranian regime, a vicious group of very hard, terrible people. Its menacing activities directly endanger the United States, our troops, our bases overseas, and our allies throughout the world. For 47 years, the Iranian regime has chanted death to America and waged an unending campaign of bloodshed and mass murder, targeting the United States, our troops, and the innocent people in many, many countries. Among the regime's very first acts was to back a violent takeover of the U.S. Embassy in Tehran, holding dozens of American hostages for 444 days. In 1983, Iran's proxies carried out the Marine barracks bombing in Beirut that killed 241 American military personnel. In 2000, they knew and were probably involved with the attack on the USS Cole. Many died. Iranian forces killed and maimed hundreds of American service members in Iraq. The regime's proxies have continued to launch countless attacks against American forces stationed in the Middle East in recent years, as well as U.S. naval and commercial vessels and international shipping lanes. It's been mass terror, and we're not going to put up with it any longer. From Lebanon to Yemen and Syria to Iraq, the regime has armed, trained, and funded terrorist militias that have soaked the earth with blood and guts. And it was Iran's proxy, Hamas.
We just heard from President Trump. That was a statement he made on his Truth Social account. In his video statement laying out the, quote, mass terror from Iran that led to this. And Charlie D'Agata, we're going to go to you. What do you make of what you just heard from the president?
Yeah, well, he sort of laid out a litany of attacks against U.S. forces here in the region, actually, which began with the takeover of the U.S. Embassy in Tehran. You are talking about decades ago. But he reminded in that message that Iran's troops or proxies have attacked the United States or U.S. interests in this region for decades, going back to not only the war in Iraq, where Iranian weaponry and Iranian proxies were taking out or were attacking and killing U.S. troops. He recalled the attack on the Marines barracks in Beirut that killed almost 300 people. The USS Cole, if you remember, in Yemen. That was one of the first attacks. And he said hundreds of attacks against U.S. forces throughout Iraq. And this is about eliminating, he said in his words, those Iranian threats that Iran continues to attack in places through their proxies in places like Lebanon, Syria, Iraq. And here, I believe he was just about to mention, by backing Hamas, after the attacks of October 7th, the worst atrocities that Israel has seen on its soil. So putting Iran as a sort of patron to all of those attacks against U.S. forces, U.S. allies, is a way of justifying it. What we don't know yet is whether this is the beginning of a long campaign, whether this is a messaging to get Iran essentially to lay down its weapons, to not fight back, to find some sort of peaceful arrangement, or face much more force from the United States and Israel, for that matter, going ahead. And obviously, this is something that would be classified even if we had that information as to what's going to go forward. But just to remind our viewers, we were woken to air raid sirens this morning at about 8:20. And that wasn't because there was incoming. That was to alert the people of Israel from the IDF, Israeli Defense Forces, that an attack was underway, a joint attack between the United States and Israel, hitting targets we know in Tehran from our folks on the ground and in 4 other cities inside Iran. As far as we know, the Iranians haven't tried a retaliation. There's only been 1 air raid siren, but the Iranians said that they would, and they can. They have the capacity to do so with their missiles that can reach here in Israel and to U.S. forces in this region. So that's where we stand now, and that was sort of what President Trump laid out, that this is kind of like an opening salvo to what we may see in the days and weeks ahead.
All right, Charlie, thank you. Olivia Gazis has been with us on this breaking news story in these overnight hours. Olivia, what do you make of what the president said in that statement?
He's clearly reaching back over many decades of history to make clear that this is a long-standing foe, and it is his intention to settle the matter once and for all. His message didn't actually focus on the nuclear program, which had been at the forefront of the talks that had been taking place. And that was also amid concerns that the talks weren't solving for the broader issue of some of the threats that he had cited. There had been elements of the administration that had been pushing for a broader negotiated deal with Iran that would have addressed not just the nuclear program insofar as it was being reconstituted, but Iran's vast stockpile of missiles, its funding of regional proxies, Hezbollah, the Houthis, Hamas. Secretary Rubio had said publicly that in order for talks to be, quote, meaningful, they needed to address all of those things, not just the nuclear program, but also its missiles and its support for regional proxies. But indications that we got publicly were that the talks that had been taking place had the nuclear issue as its central focus, with missiles and proxy behavior as sort of ancillary things to address, and that may have sort of put things over the finish line, as it were, that, there wasn't enough headway being made on the nuclear question, and the other outstanding issues were just too large for the administration to be satisfied in terms of the threat that Iran poses to the region, and as the president said there, to Americans in the region.
Right. He's part of what he said. We are going to destroy their missiles and raise their missile industry to the ground. It will be totally, again, obliterated. We're going to annihilate their Navy. Some pretty harsh words that he's going all in on this. Doesn't it sound that way, Olivia?
It does, and it's hard to say at this very early stage whether that is an achievable objective. I'll defer to Charlie and the military experts who know what the U.S. and Israel are positioned to do, but those are ambitious targets for the U.S. to want to pursue all at once. Obviously, the regime is going to want to retaliate. I think we've gotten an indication of that from Iranian officials in the region, and unless there is a sound decapitation of its leadership from the supreme leader on down, senior officials in the IRGC and the Basij, this is a regime that has dug in before, and this is a regime that has made clear that its primary goal is survival, and that is the reason that it has for a long time sought to portray itself as a threshold nuclear state, to stockpile as many missiles and build as many missile launchers as possible. But there's a very real known shortage of interceptors at the moment. So the likelihood that this campaign can be sustained beyond 8 to 10 days, according to officials we've been speaking with, is pretty low. So it remains to be seen just how big and how sweeping the campaign that the U.S. and Israel appear to be engaging in right now together can go in further stages.
Yeah, he says we will ensure that Iran does not obtain a nuclear weapon. To the members of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard, the armed forces, and all of the police, I say tonight that you must lay down your weapons and have complete immunity. or in the alternative, face certain death. So lay down your arms. You will be treated fairly with total immunity, or you will face certain death. He says that again. Now, this escalation, it just seems like, could this make it harder or impossible maybe to reach any kind of agreement at this point? What happens after this?
Any room for diplomacy if you're taking the president at his word and you see what accompanying military efforts he unleashes alongside Israel. As we had mentioned, there were supposed to have been technical talks taking place in Vienna involving the nuclear watchdog there. We were waiting for confirmation whether the U.S. was planning to participate. Iranian negotiators were there to continue discussing the nuclear portfolio amid signals from the mediators, the Omanis and others, that there was a real appetite to continue trying to find a peaceful solution, and using the argument that absent diplomacy, the multi-pronged issues here are not going to be resolved. It is far from clear whether those Monday talks continue to see if there can be a curtailment of the military campaign underway here. That was the word that we had as of late Friday, all very much an open question now as the attack has gotten underway.
Olivia, I'm going to go to Charlie in a second, but let me ask you really quickly. Let's talk about the global ramifications of a strike like this, the possibility perhaps of Russia or China getting involved. Can you touch on that a little bit for folks at home who may be concerned that this may turn into something much bigger?
Well, we do know that the Iranians had been engaging the Russians and the Chinese, soliciting their support militarily, diplomatically. It's unclear whether either power is going to lean in support because of exactly what you cite, which is a much broader global conflagration. I don't know that we are on the precipice of that now. There had been uneasiness on the part of U.S. allies in the region. The U.K. had apparently declined to let the U.S. use its bases to stage air power in the region. Gulf states were reluctant to allow U.S. overflight and use of their airspace for any offensive activity. So the U.S. was very much going it alone with Israel to begin with, notionally, before this actually got underway. And it is very much unclear if there are casualties, whether U.S. allies are going to come robustly to the U.S.'s defense. That's an open question. These are early stages. And just how broadly this goes depends now on how the Iranians respond and what the tit for tat looks like from there.
All right, you mentioned casualties. For this next question, I'm going to go back to Charlie. President Trump acknowledges the possibility of American casualties, Charlie. He says the lives of courageous American heroes may be lost and we may have casualties. That often happens in war. But we're doing this not for now, but for the future. And it is a noble mission. That's what the president is saying. Charlie. I hear sirens in the background as well, Charlie.
Sorry, we're just having another siren. Yeah, it's okay for now. Do we have to go in? We're all right. We'll hold. Okay. All right. Sorry about that. Just give me a minute. Yeah. So I wasn't able to listen to everything that President Trump was saying there. It's a pretty exhaustive explanation about what's going to happen. He sets out a prolonged conflict with Iran. He's urging the Iranian military to lay down their arms, that they would be given some sort of amnesty to not fight back. Otherwise, they're going to face certain death. In addition to that, after he's told the people of Iran to get into a safe place, wait essentially for the dust to settle, because he's laying the groundwork for what sounds to be a prolonged bombing campaign in Iran, and then to come out and overthrow the government. So these are the strongest words that we would have heard. This is not a sort of symbolic first strike. It may be sending a message. Again, you just heard the sirens going off, which doesn't necessarily indicate that we have incoming, because we'll hear the air raid sirens as well, and they tend to be very specific and localized. But they have to expect that Iran's going to retaliate. But yes, this sort of level of reaching out, not a message just to the people of the United States, but to the people of Iran too, and obviously to the people of Israel. Now, when you talk about U.S. forces, you know, he would have been given a list of the counterattacks and the capabilities of Iran's forces and proxies within this region. Proxies have been severely denigrated over the past 2 years, partly with the help of Israel taking out, you know, the larger groups like sort of Hezbollah, but there are also Iranian-backed proxies throughout the Middle East, some some known, some covert, that have frequently targeted U.S. Forces in the past. But if Iran is to launch, their capacity and capability of the missiles, they have missiles that were within easy reach of U.S. forces, and not all of them can be intercepted. So I think this is just a sort of reality check that if this is going to be a prolonged war, that President Trump is warning Americans that they will be in the line of fire and they will be attacked, and this is the cost of war. So that all of those statements that I just made are a surprise and sort of laying out, because we had been anticipating, is it going to be limited strikes, is it going to be regime change? And it sounds from the language that President Trump is using that this is all in, telling the military to just lay down their arms, don't fight back, you'll face certain death, telling the people of Iran to get low, and when it's over, come and overthrow the government. This is regime change, and it's going to take a lot, and that's why when we talk about how much has been brought into this in terms of the military assets into this region, there's a lot. Mostly, and I keep underlining this fact, are the aerial assets, the fighter jets, the cruise missiles. These are offensive weapons, but there also will be defensive weapons in order to protect U.S. forces at bases here, and also the extraordinary amount of naval assets at sea.
Charlie D'Agata for us in Israel. Thank you so much for that. We also need to thank Olivia Gazis, who's been with us on this breaking news story from the Middle East. The U.S. and Israel launching what they're calling a preemptive strike against Iran. We understand, once again, this is a joint U.S. and Israeli strike, which hit in Iran's capital of Tehran, near the offices of Iran's supreme leader. It is being reported that Iran's supreme leader was not in Tehran at the time, was transferred to a secure location. Our coverage will continue on CBS News 24/7, your local news, and CBS Saturday Morning. This has been a CBS News special report. I'm Carissa Lawson in New York.